So hardwired as a survival mechanism that we take our tribe, our people, what they say and what they do to reassure that we are going to have access to their resources, and that sense of belonging.
Welcome back to the Uncommon Podcast. I'm your host, Benjamin Dunford. On today's episode, we have my friend Travis. Travis is a therapist. He's currently living in northern Idaho and is an absolute expert in his field. Today, specifically, we get into everything from trauma to experience, perspective, gratitude, social media. Travis also gives us some insights from the perspective of the therapist on the current system and model of therapy that we have in the United States right now. I also asked some questions from the audience off of social media, so be on the lookout for those. Ladies and gentlemen, Travis Stevens. Have you heard of the ship of Theseus?
I have not heard of Ship of Theseus.
Okay, it's like a philosophical, like kind of thought experiment type of thing. So basically, picture this: picture a very well used boat. Okay, and during the life of this ship, parts break down and are replaced. The mast, for instance, is lost in a storm, so they get a new one. Some of the wood rots and is replaced. The bolts and the nails rust away and then are eventually replaced with fresh ones. And eventually, none of the original materials that made up the ship are there. Yet the boat still sails, same as ever. Is this the same boat or a different boat now?
That is a really good question. Ship of Theseus, huh?
I think that's how they say it. Yeah, and it leads into some conversation about like people's physical continuity and things like that. But for individuals, as you could kind of see the connection there. But they use this example of a ship to kind of get the thoughts stirring.
Well, it is completely relevant. Our physical bodies will transfer between cellular growth, regeneration, and death every 7 years. It's not completely accurate. I mean, there's certain things, but even to your own bones, they will break down and regenerate. And some are very short-lived and some are a little bit longer, but they say essentially you're a new person every 7 years.
That is so funny that you said that, because I literally had wrote down a note about the exact same thing. What I found was that the body replaces its cells every 7 to 10 years, with the exceptions of the neurons in your cerebral cortex, which stay from birth to death. But besides those, everything else replaces itself. So then the question or the dilemma is the same, right? Like what makes you the same from moment to moment?
So in that context, even though all the parts are replaced based upon the original blueprint, it is the same ship. It's the same concept of ship, even though it's not the same parts.
Interesting.
So the identity of the ship is the same, but all the parts are different.
Okay. I like that answer. So it's what matters there is the sense of ship, of the sense of it being a complete object, or that has a mission and a goal and a purpose.
Yep.
And
it has a name and a purpose, and the other thing is it is designed in a specific way. Now, if they cut it in half and extended it 20 feet, and it would be a little bit harder to call it the same ship because it doesn't have the same parameters as the original design.
Yeah. So how do you feel like this compares to the same concept, but on the human form, on the physical body?
Well, just as we had talked, the other fascinating thing, even though the neurons have longevity, we have this concept of neuroplasticity, which the neurons make and break ungodly amounts of connections all the time, and even even though the cell is the wiring to create that is never the same. It changes over time. And so our perception of memories is malleable, and most people don't understand that if you're going to remember the last time you remembered it sculpts the memory. And so sometimes within therapy is what we do is we interject sometimes even a completely false memory into that recipe that actually affects the memory of the event. It changes the event as a person experiences it. It's one of the things that we do through IFS is going, take the little you and put them back into a scenario, and then you modify the scenario, you modify the experience, you then in this infinite creator capacity as the observer and constructor of this scene. Maybe the little you needed a puppy at the time to feel safe or something. You interject that into that reflection of the memory, and it rewrites that it profoundly affects it. So much so that a lot of individuals can heal that trauma, that hardwired trauma response, so that they do not have their autonomic nervous system become reactive to, being put into a similar situation as that when they was young. And that's one way in which PTSD can be healed.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because essentially, it's truly not real. We are truly only right here, right now. And you have an experience, your colleagues have an experience, but you do not have the same experience, even though you're in the same space at the same time, both remember, recite the same thing. Your perception of it is completely different.
From person to person. Yeah.
There's a lot of things that our brain fills in with facts that are not facts. One very simple example is when you go in and you look in the bathroom mirror. Do you feel that the bathroom mirror gives you a accurate representation of how maybe others perceive you or what they're seeing?
Personally, I think so.
So if you're looking in a mirror and you raise your right hand, what hand does the mirrored person raise?
The mirror person would be raising their left hand.
It is completely 100% reversed. And yet
Yeah.
we don't even have that connection when we see that we are looking at a reverse image of us. But we take it for fact that of course I move, it moves, and not even realizing it is completely a falsified, flipped version of what anyone would see.
So like, yeah, so why put so much value on it when it's literally an incorrect representation of you?
Yes, and well, there's the first person experience, another person's experience, and then the objective environmental experience, like a fly on the wall, a camcorder that records it.
Yeah.
Depending on the perspective, depending on the perception. Another example, I'll write the number 9 and I'll put it on a piece of paper and I'll lay it in front of me and I say, what number did I write? And they're like, 6, because they're reading it upside down.
Yeah.
And when you can recognize how much our brain will process in false information, you can then contour it into having an experience that you choose. Another concept is if you stub your toe on the coffee table and it shoots pain up there and you turning black and blue, your focus on your little toe is very astute. You don't focus on the other toe that's just fine, not even in your field of perception, and how much other things are happening. But pain has a way of drawing our attention, and that's one of the things. It's a life preserving measure, evolutionarily wise or other. Pain says you need to hyper focus on whatever this is. It's easy to recognize in a coffee table, but it's harder to recognize when somebody insults you, when somebody puts you down, or judges you, or shames you. Well, it's just an experience. It's information. Just as the pain signals are information for your brain to say, hey, don't bump us again. We were just injured, and I'm going to keep sending you this pain signal. So you might choose to not kick the coffee table again. We don't enjoy that.
Interesting. Yeah.
And so if
That's
you can take those life painful experiences as a message, even the insults, it's like, oh, well, this person, and again, recognize we have a skewed perception. You might meet 1,000 other people and they would not have the same perception of you. So what makes this person's perception accurate? Why do we put so much weight on this person? Oh, it's my partner, or it's my boss, and so often they're saying, you are lazy. Why didn't you go roll up those hoses? Well, I was using the bathroom and I don't care. You're lazy. They're framing your complete identity into one moment in time in a simple action without the totality of that information. And yet we'll be like, oh my God, I feel like I'm so lazy. We take it as fact. And it's only perception. And so if we can take control of our internal state versus allowing the environment to take control of our internal state, we get to choose. We are in control of our reality. We're in control of our perceptions. It's kind of a
Wow.
fun thought to be able to shift yourself so profoundly.
Yeah, and it's not complicated.
And it's not complicated. And yet how
Yeah.
easily do we fall into the trap of
Yeah.
you're a liar. Your whole identity is a liar. I am not lying. You misunderstood what I said. No, I don't care. You're a liar. Your whole identity from birth to death is a liar. It
Yeah,
is not accurate.
it's a very simple little tweak in perspective on the same situation that can be so profound on your experience in that situation. And it feels like so many of us are like predisposed to have this kind of the toxic side of that, just
Absolutely.
like readily available for us at any moment. Where do you think that comes from? Why do you think that it's so many of us have that that inclination to just take everything everybody else says as, oh well, I must be lazy, and exactly as you were describing it?
I would say it comes from the programming that is multi-generational, that we have societal programs, and human beings are the most complicated social creatures. No other creatures can communicate information and work collectively as human beings do. You might
Yeah.
like your shirt and said, yeah, I bought it. but how many people had to just even to have a shirt, probably had to be shipped from China, and the 10-year-old factory worker had to, run the machine. Then somebody created the machine, and somebody picked the cotton, and somebody sewed it together, and then shipped it and marketed it. And how many people had to be directly involved with just buying a T-shirt?
Yeah.
And if we were completely solo, to be honest, we're not awesome animals. We don't have fur, teeth, We might think we were really tough. I don't know if you've seen those, adventures where they put them in the wilderness, but they don't crush it.
Yeah, yeah, we're a power in numbers type of species and a power in collaboration type of species.
And so, probably our ancient ancestors, if they were exiled from that social construct, it could very much be life threatening. So the people that were very sensitive to it, that tried to correct their behaviors, that tried to keep themselves re-immersed in that social structures, they survived. And then the ancestors that were, perhaps the Neanderthals, they weren't very social creatures, and they become extinct because of their lack of sociability. And so, hardwired as a survival mechanism, that we take our tribe, our people, what they say and what they do to reassure that we are going to have access to their resources, and that sense of belonging. And even on the most simplistic level, a perpetuation of our species. If you're not a very social person, really hard to get a date.
Interesting. So you think that there's a component there of genetic predisposition to really to care about what the people around you think and say.
Well, and it strikes in our most primitive parts of our brain when we're getting really stressed out that we're being rejected. Our autonomic nervous system is a very old part of our brain. A lot of times it doesn't make sense to be panicked. Like, people will feel that their life has ended when their boyfriend has broken up with them. And sometimes it does end, just based upon a perception that was everything. Because it hijacks the higher mind. If I tell you, I want you to meditate and I'm going to catch your foot on fire, you're probably going to have a really hard time staying in that Zen headspace.
Yeah.
Your autonomic nervous system is going to go, hell no, we're going to get my foot away from the fire, because it is highly motivating to do that.
Interesting. And how does that that because you're talking about that kind of as a built-in nervous system type response to abandonment
Mm-hmm.
or fire on your foot, and kind of how those would be the same type of responses. How does that differ from a traumatic response? And I know we'll get into trauma a little bit more too, but I just was curious on that.
Uh, to be honest, your brain receiving a threat is a threat, and danger is danger. A lot of people end up with phobias that is an automatic wiring of the brain. And even in the neurology of it, when you have a traumatic experience, it sends such a powerful signal, and neurons, Hebb's law is what they call it, neurons that fire together wire together. And when you have a profound experience, it essentially hardwires multiple neurons. So there's a lot of energy allocated to, we need to remember this. And so then that creates a traumatic response. If you get into a car accident last week, you can probably tell me every detail of the second of that car accident, but might have a hard time telling me what you did at that exact time the day before, and in any quality of memory, because it wasn't retained, because it did not have that same force of wiring in that retention.
Yeah, there's a lot of misconceptions about trauma as a word, as a concept. Um, could you, what is trauma? Could you explain it? And then what does it mean for the person who has just found out that they have it?
Um, it's a I don't know what other people's definition of it would be, but I would say it's uh, a person's inability to regulate given an environment, given a stimulus. You could equate it to medical trauma. You know, you sustained an injury, and even if it was a minor injury, somebody may die from the shock, like literally medical shock, when the injury was not life threatening. That their body had the inability to compensate for the initial injury. And our mind, in a similar way, other people, if they lost a finger, uh, most people will be okay. But there are some people that are so susceptible to that injury and headspace and perception, their body would start shutting down as though they were preparing to die. And then start losing their ability to perfuse their vital organs and die from that, where losing their finger is not a life-threatening injury.
Mm-hmm.
So trauma is not what happened, it's a person's ability to compensate for what happened.
Okay.
And that's
That's really
why
interesting.
there's people try to, trauma is not a competition sport. Well, you shouldn't be traumatized from that. You should have met my mom.
Yeah. Yeah.
It has no relevance. It's what skills and tools and abilities.
Interesting. Okay. So if somebody just, found out that they have trauma, they've just heard this for the first time, right? Um, I mean, everybody does to some degree, right? Um, but they were just unaware. They thought that trauma was only for soldiers and victims and things like that. Um, what does this mean for them now? And
So one thing that frustrates me in psychology is a lot of people, they have a stigma around trauma. Oh, I'm traumatized, or you can't be traumatized. Um, I was shot in a robbery, and you were slapped by your husband or whatever. I mean, they're going back to that basics, that it's personal experiences of abilities, a person's ability to compensate for the event. But what really frustrates me is what's called post-traumatic growth, and it is seldom talked about. If you get lost in the woods and you're very traumatized from it, you're dehydrated, how much better prepared are you anytime you go outside and anytime you go in the woods? How much did you gain from that profound experience in adjusting yourself so that next time that never happens again? In personal matters, you have a abusive parent, and then you hear some of the same verbiage coming from a potential partner. It probably saved you a lot of anguish by going, wait a second, I've heard these words before, and I'm not going to re-expose myself to it. And it helps you far more often, even having the recording and protecting you from going into a dangerous space.
hmm.
But they focus on that trauma as such a negative and horrific thing, and absolutely it can be. But even to give it value, you had this trauma. How did that scope your personality? You had, say, an unkind parent. How did that help you become a kind person? You had a abusive environment. How did that help you from managing your anger to where you're not abusive? And help cultivate you into a better person by knowing what you're not.
Hmm. And it almost seems like that's kind of discovering that would be part of the process of healing the trauma that everyone talks
Yes.
about. Oh, I want to heal the trauma. I want to heal this, and how
Yes.
do I heal my trauma? That potentially, it doesn't mean maybe healing the trauma doesn't mean um, you know, working through it to the point where now you don't think about it anymore and it's completely erased from your experience and your memory, because that's impossible. But you're learning how to integrate it into your life in a way that's serving you and not, causing more problems, perhaps.
So, 100%. And that's where post-traumatic stress disorder comes from, is you're reactivating the autonomic nervous system, rehearsing that mindset. It becomes highly activated, starts running tons of hormones that regulate your thoughts and where your brain is energized. And the unfortunate thing is, so you experience the traumatic event, and then you find a trigger and you re-experience the traumatic event. The first one, I say an abusive parent, the first one, the parent had responsibility in that. Somebody yells at you and you become reactivated again. The person yelling at you had no idea that it was activating a traumatic response. There was no intention of harm in any way. But by lack of control, we injure ourselves by not having that control. And that's where the post-traumatic stress is. Not having that personal control, not seeing the growth, not understanding the value of a traumatic experience. They don't have the mastery of self, and then they become reactivated into that trauma response. But it's not somebody else, it's them doing it to them. They already paid the price once, and every time they reactivate without that control, they pay the price over and over and over again in a negative impact in their life. And it creates an interesting thought of forgiveness. Again, everyone has their own perspective. There might be some absolutely terrible people, terrible things happen. Seldom are people completely malice, maleficent, if you will, in their behaviors. And if they are, there's something going on why they are, because it's not within our natural sociability. And we don't know why they did that. We just know what they did. But they did it for a reason, and us holding on to it doesn't hurt that original person. They go on throughout their life, not even a clue that they're becoming reactivated over and over again. So you're not holding them accountable. It's only harming oneself. And the stronger you hold on to it, continuously injuring your life. And the power of habit, if somebody is, I'm healing. It's one of my frustrations in the therapeutic realm. It has become their identity that they are always healing. That I am a broken person in some way, and I have to not be broken. And they stay stuck in that loop because they really don't understand what they would be without that. That is part of my history, part of my narrative, part of who I am. And so they have a reluctance to release that, because without that, well, then I would be accountable for my explosions at work, or I would be, no, it's a trauma response from whatever. Then they don't take accountability. Well, nobody out there has any awareness of what you went through. Even if you tell them, they might be able to formulate a mental picture, but all they see is you freaking out at work and going, hey, that's not great to be around, and then there's consequences for it. But taking accountability for self and realizing that identity of, I'm a traumatized, I'm a victim mindset. That's one that's really tough for me to help people get ahead of, is a victim mindset. There's terrible stuff happens to all kinds of people. Great stuff that happens to all kinds of people. But if they stay stuck in that victim mindset, they had created their own trap. They're trapped in their own cage of thought.
Mm.
And those are hard ones to break.
Because that makes it difficult to do kind of what we were talking about and to see the trauma from a different perspective. Because if
Hmm.
you're seeing it constantly from this angle of, oh, I'm a victim of this event and there is absolutely nothing that I can gain from this. This only hurts me.
Hmm.
Then you'll never be able to use that modality of healing like we were talking about and to see it from a different to use it because I kind of the way I think of it is it happened.
Yep.
Whether you, I mean, obviously you didn't fucking want it to happen, right? So like, but it
Hmm.
did,
Hmm.
and so like now you're left with this thing that you have to process and deal with, and it's your cross to bear, if you will, right? Like you're a grown human adult, and one of the ways that like we're talking about that you can move forward past that is to use it as a post traumatic growth opportunity, like you were saying. And if you're completely unable to shift from that victim mindset, then you'll never be able to see it from there. Because I feel like victim mindset is it's okay, like that happens, right? And maybe it's a phase of the process. Like let yourself be a victim, you know,
Just don't get
and
stuck.
just don't get stuck there. Yeah,
Right.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah, that's a really interesting way of seeing that.
So there is truly some gold in adverse environmental conditions, adverse conditions in general. If if you are raised in a horrifically abusive environment, how motivated are you to make sure your neighbor's children are not stuck in a horrifically abusive environment? You might become a social worker and go in and help protect kids. You might become a police officer. But when you can convert that personal experience, it helps you show up on the days that are hard. It helps you because you have that drive and that motivation because you converted it into a driving force that other people don't have access to that same driving force.
Mm.
And that works even with phobias. You and I both have experience in being a firefighter. I thought out of all the ways to die, burning to death would probably be not a great way to check out.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and fears of my kids being trapped in a burning house and dying these horrific deaths and having fear, and that motivates me to introduce myself into studies to make sure that these horrible things don't happen to my beloved people in my life, and it helps keep me on that track and then become more and more masterful of it. And now I don't particularly have a fear of it because I understand fire behavior. I understand, how that the radiation of heat transfers to the body and the time and the protective measures, and I have this skill set to not only help myself but to help all the people I care about in my community. But it's because of that fear, because of trauma. And if you can tap into that, there are very few things that motivate people, but a traumatic event is very motivating, both to the negative, but they don't realize it can be positive motivation too. Life's goal.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. Even just now, as you're talking about it, and you're saying it in that way, I can almost feel. Personally, I almost feel lighter just thinking
Yeah.
about it in terms of my perspective. Like we all have this mountain of trauma that we carry around all the time, most of which no fault of our own, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's so easy. I'm kind of repeating myself, but it's so easy to stay from that victim perspective and to just feel like it's dragging you down all the time. And it's interesting, just that small shift, and to hear it from somebody like you, just that like there's good things that can come from this, and it's okay to let those things happen, you know, like the things that you do learn and the things that do the good things that do come from it. That
Hmm?
fear can be a very driving factor, right? As long as it's managed and that you're it's coming from the right place, you
Yes.
know. Um, Obviously, you don't want to be just completely guided by fear all the time, like because that won't lead to good things.
Hmm. Hmm.
But even just that small shift in perspective, I can even feel myself right now in this moment, just kind of like, huh,
And
like
and we can do that in any how we frame it. Who's writing your story? Is it your job? Is it your spouse? Is it the community? Who writes your story? I would rather write my own story.
yeah, yeah,
I would rather be in control of the pen and shift the perspective of, you know, thing life happens, adversity continuously. Um, One of the ways that we're always seeking a better, more comfortable, easier life. Uh, the term they use is hedonic adaptation. We adapt to happiness. If you came home and your house caught on fire, it would probably have an impact on you.
yes,
Oh my
yeah,
gosh, that was a great house, and I had all this cool stuff and all these cool things. How much during the last week did you appreciate all those things that you would have lost conceptually?
not enough of them.
Like, we don't even realize, hey, yeah, that's my favorite baseball glove or whatever.
Whatever. Yeah.
And so sometimes the world might be limited as to how many widgets you can buy or other things, but simply stepping back and living a life of gratitude and creating lightness within you. Our commercial, it's our society's like, you got to have the newest dishwasher, to get that sparkly clean and this and that. Well, when you bought your old dishwasher, it was just fine, but now they to market to you, to get the money out of your pocket, they want your energy and effort that it took to create that money that now is in their pockets. But just having a gratitude for what we have.
Hmm.
Um, One concept shift that if you were born 200 years ago, how would your life be different than it is today? And how many modern conveniences do you take for granted? You're like, well, I got to work 40 hours a week and drive to the store and pick my stuff up. And 200 years ago, you didn't drive anywhere. You got your saddle on your horse and
Yeah.
you rode for 4 hours to the, store. Maybe they have something more than the basic necessities, but probably not. And you didn't work 40 hours a week. You worked sun up to sundown every day because that's what was necessary is for farming. And your beloved may have died from getting pricked by a rose bush and got a blood infection, and they didn't have antibiotics, and you might have had six children
Yeah.
and they all passed away in birth because that's what the rate was in the modern medicine. And how much of that just in 200
Yeah.
years do we take for granted?
Yeah.
And that's just one shift of perspective of like, we live in one of the most gilded ages in all of humanity. In 200 years, I mean, in the span of humanity, that's
Small.
microscopic, really. It's just, yeah,
Yeah.
just, and there was some really dark chapters, the dark ages of if you made the king mad, he would torture you to death. I mean, there wasn't no one there protecting you. You stayed in line because really bad things can happen. Now we're like,
Yeah.
I might have to go to court and testify in my own behalf. And well, even a while ago, there's a lot of things that was not so good, you know. And then we have this nostalgia effect. Remember the good old days? I'd love to be a pioneer out on the West. Would you?
Yeah.
You know how that really looked?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah,
But
we do. We have our fair share of modern problems, but as with most things, you'd probably take these problems instead of the other ones.
one of my favorite phrases is comparison is the thief of joy.
Mm.
We can always find somebody that's in this or that. And you know, in our modern construct is how many times do you look on Facebook and your friends are on vacation and all these wonderful things? That's not their everyday. That's the highlight reels. But our brain is just seeing that. It's like, oh, the Joneses, man, they're going to Europe every month and have all these wonderful dinners, and my life's pretty pathetic in comparison. And I'm not joyful for my amazing life.
Yeah, actually, you bringing that up reminds there's a one of the audience questions was, what are your thoughts on social media and its effects on this generation?
Absolutely. I mean, that's one aspect of it.
Hmm.
The other thing is modern humans have one really strong fear: inconvenience. That's a highly motivating thing. There, we are a society of instant gratification. And if you don't believe me, check out the checkout line at the grocery store. If it's more than four people, people are getting irritated. They're really put out.
Oh yeah.
A stoplight, you're waiting like less than a minute at a stoplight, and how upset do people get to just wait for other people to cross, and they're impatient. It's this instant gratification society, and social media has just set fire to that.
Mm.
You used to have to read books to get information. You know, it's not a 15-minute. Now they put a life's experience in 15 minutes in a TED Talk. And it's even, I mean, that wasn't that long ago. And now people don't even want that. They want a 30-second clip to gain all the knowledge of a person's expertise in a 30-second clip.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's profoundly affecting. And I really worry about the direction that it's going of people's ability to be present. Additionally, we are not designed to have this much stimulation, to be engaged. Again, you go back 200 years. How much stimulation did we have? How fast paced was life 200 years ago?
Mm.
You're not running, you know, the 5 miles to the mercantile to get your, you know, tractor blade or whatever. You'll get there when you get there. And enjoying the walk and enjoying the nature, um, and now people are just glued to their screens. They can be out on a romantic date and sitting there on social media, ignoring the moment, the beauty of life in the moment, because they're so
Yeah.
engaged.
Yeah, and I've heard the phrase "ancient bodies, modern world,"
Yep.
right? Like our bodies were created and evolved to be very effective in an environment that is very different than the one that we're living in now.
We, yeah,
And
we have not evolved to the modern society we live in, for sure.
and it causes a lot of issues. I mean, how many people are taking medications every day just to try to stay balanced,
Mm-hmm.
And I think like you're kind of like you're saying, and as the audience member obviously thought, like social media probably has a pretty decent impact on that in all those different things that you were talking about with instant gratification, inability to be present,
Hmm.
distraction, so
Whether
many different factors. Yeah.
uh, a Native American philosophy that, and I can't remember what tribe it was, but they said anything in excess is a poison. You can literally die from too much water, but you better have some.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You know, it in of itself is a thing. It's when it's in excess that it actually becomes damaging.
Hmm.
Say 20 years ago, we have the entire knowledge of mankind quite literally in our pocket. Almost 24 hours a day, we have access to that. And how are we using it? You know, are we dancing cat videos, or is it, furthering our knowledge and our experience of life?
Hmm.
And so it's just a tool. But unfortunately, some of the driving forces of this instant gratification, um, within the nature of humanity, a lot of people do not utilize it well.
So what in some of our previous conversation, I've picked up that it seems like there are that you have discovered in your time as a therapist some problems with the current therapy system and model. Um, what are those issues, and how can somebody navigate those in an effective way?
Well, one difficulty is people that need it the most may not have access to it. People
Okay.
that have, for whatever reason, had significant setbacks and struggles, they're not functioning well in life. The homeless population, for example. Yes, we have social constructs that can help, but unfortunately, the way that it's structured, it is not very romantic as a therapist to go work with the homeless population, because they do not fund it at a way in which you can actually have a decent quality of life. And then on the other end, the individuals that have a very charmed life, the wife of the multimillionaire, about her hairdresser getting the wrong color of tint and how traumatic that was for her. It becomes, kind of this token. Well, my therapist justified my rage for my hair not being tinted correctly, or good-hearted, good-intended individuals are not always accessing the population in which they could make the greatest impact. Um, and then it's a for-profit model. The um, you have to bill, and then you have to justify, and create treatment plans and create all these things that, in real time, it's good to have in mind, but they want like a written out, documentation of this is the treatment plan for this individual, and have some accountability for following it. The other unfortunate thing is other people, life coaches or otherwise, could absolutely do what I do with my license, but they don't have this social support of, you spend 8 years in school, you've done your due diligence, it gives you validation. That doesn't make a person effective. It just makes a person willing to endure a lot of stuff to get to that point. A recent continuing education training that I had that was related to ethics and different things, they said um, the average therapist will be in a therapy setting between 5 and 7 years after they've got their full licensure. And it can take 8 to 10 years to get your full licensure, and then you have an average expectancy of 5 to 7 years. It it's it's due to the model and how stressful it is. The other thing is being fully present. The concept of a 40-hour work week. If you could imagine being 100% fully present 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, it is profoundly exhausting. And then most people are compassionate to have that authentic space. You're there present with them as they're processing the trauma. You're feeling through empathy what they've experienced, helping them through that. And so they're like, well, we'll pay you, $40 an hour. Sounds all great, but you're only going to be able to do 20 hours a week because it is so personally taxing. They're like, well, self-care, I can go to dinner all I want, but putting in that many hours to create a viable living is pretty tough. So there's a lot of the system that we have is not designed for success. I don't think that there's a perfect model out there, but there's sure a lot of countries that seem like they have it figured out at least a little better than what we do.
So it seems like part of the problem potentially is that in order to be as effective of a therapist as you would like to be, you have to be very much tuned in and turned on into this dynamic with your patient or your client, and and you have to show up authentically, and you have to give a shit is what it seems like.
Yeah, and
right,
and that takes energy,
and that takes a lot of energy, and that you can only do that for so many hours, but there's an expectation that you do that for the same amount of hours as a construction worker works on putting electrical wires through a building, and he spends half of that on his phone scrolling through social media.
Right.
Right, and it's like that doesn't seem right to me.
It's the model we got, and it extends to a lot of different career fields, whether it be doctors or nurses or you do the best you can with what we got, and then you figure out how much you can and can't participate in it. I do love the concept. There's a few agencies, one that I'm working with here in Spokane. They create a model for individuals going with their veterans, PTSD. It's all free to them. They just sign up and they are provided with therapy for free. And you're like, well, don't they have the VA? Government regulations, it doesn't always produce the best end results. So even though they have access to it, some of these outside models where they can just fully legitimately be themselves, and there's another difficulty if you're a veteran and you're diagnosed with PTSD. Well, the ramifications is you will not be able to commission as an officer. You will not be able to advance in rank because they see you then as a broken person, even though you're trying to get help. And even though they're the ones that broke you, now you're a broken person and you can't advance your career due to what is documented by the therapist's perspective. And it's only, an hour a week perspective of the highlight reels of the bad things that have happened. So it's just nice that they can have those. The hard thing is it's a really difficult, sustainable model on donations alone to be able to provide that. I would love that all humans were provided with a support system where they could be fully authentic and, kind of have a check-in. And it seems to me it's one of the illnesses of our society. that used to be our friends. It used to be our family and our parents. And but now, sitting down at dinner, we're not actually deeply connecting. We're scrolling through social media, finding the highlight reels, being distracted.
Hmm.
And people don't want to have that space with their colleagues because it's like, well, yeah, I don't actually really want to put the energy, because it does take energy, and that um, uh, synergistic relationship is not created where both people get out of the relationship more than either one puts into it. Because it's just more convenient to, yeah, I'll text you, or I'll scroll with you, or we don't even have phone calls anymore. 50 years ago, you had to sit by the phone and wait for your friend for hours to call. Oh, let me know if Johnny called, and the phone rings and they pull it off the wall, and now we can't even answer. Let it
Yeah.
go to voicemail or send me a text.
I'm curious. I wanted to go back to something that you had said earlier. Um, we were talking about the toll that it takes on you as a therapist to stay tuned in and to give a shit about your patients, and to almost have a to almost be connected into the experience that they're processing through, and how the toll that that can take on you. Is there what do they teach? I'm curious. Like it in how you're supposed to approach that dynamic as a therapist. Are you supposed to stay completely hands off? Are you supposed to stay very stoic? Or are you supposed to become a little bit emotionally involved? For example, actually, my mom was telling me that a therapist that she's been working with that's been very helpful for her, and they've been working through a lot of really intense things. Every once in a while, my mom will look up, and the therapist will just very quickly wipe away a tear,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it's not like lost she's lost it and she's fallen apart on the other side of the room, right? But she's not allowing she's not holding back all of the emotions that are coming up.
Right.
How do you balance that as a therapist in that dynamic, and what is helpful, what isn't, what's necessary and what's not?
I would use an analogy of what they teach. It's like teaching somebody to be an artist, and you can teach them what colors go together to create different colors, and what brush strokes and what brush to use and what format and what. But you really can't teach that being fully present, and how much to give and not give, and hold back and not hold back, and um, there's not a model, so it's not taught. And unfortunately, when people go into that and they become really effective, it ended up taking a toll, and they leave the career field because they just financially can't afford it, and then emotionally can't afford it to continue to be in that space.
Hmm.
And that's why there's a tremendous shortage of people providing caring support. And the other unfortunate thing is it's so restrictive and so horrifically regulated. Um, like, I have to, in every single state, I have to do a full application and pay the $300 for the insurance and the application fee, and justify my entire existence of history, um, complete background checks to every state. And so right now I'm in northern Idaho, and if I want to go 20 miles over the line, it's a whole new application, a whole new just to be able to have somebody access that. They don't accommodate for telehealth. It's very uh, reactive, not proactive. Now, telehealth therapy is very common, but literally, it's unlawful for me to talk to somebody because I'm practicing without a license because I didn't apply for their permission, even though federally I'm approved, but that state hasn't approved me and I can't talk to somebody. We had colleagues that literally tell people you have to drive over the bridge over the state lines because they cannot provide therapy in that state. It's ridiculous. Those kind of regulations that just create frustrating barriers. Um, like I said, I don't know if there's a great model. And the other thing is just because somebody's good at school and they think that they're going to be effective, there's a lot of people that get the license to do that um, do not align, and some people end up being very damaged from the therapist not being able to put themselves on the side and utilizing an approach that makes sense to them through their perspective, but they're not meeting the client where they're at. And I've seen a lot of therapists that can create harm because so much weight has been put on to what they say. And another issue is diagnosing is a very difficult science. In the hour that I spend talking to somebody, creating a diagnosis, and they want it generally they want a billable diagnosis the first time you meet with them. Sometimes some situations it can be later. But how do I measure, like, qualitatively who you are in a diagnosable disorder in an hour? We're way more complicated than that. And even, it's saying these group of symptoms are present, but there's socially a stigma on it. If I say Joe is bipolar, oh man, got to watch out for Joe. Or we're complicated individuals.
Yeah.
And to have that much pressure that Joe can't buy a firearm anymore because I diagnosed him with schizophrenia.
How helpful do you think that those labels are for people?
They can be, but they can also be hard, just like everything else. It can be helpful and it can be hurtful. Realizing somebody, say, is schizophrenic, great. There's wonderful medication that they can now have access to, that they can see things from a new and different perspective. They may have an understanding that some of the things that they're experiencing, not everybody shares their experience. But then on the other hand, of not finding housing, and you can't work with children or in law enforcement or in any kind of security measures, or because now you have a mental disorder, even if you keep it completely in check. And so it's difficult. It's beneficial on one end. It can be very detrimental on the other.
Yeah.
And these are some of the things that weigh heavily of it, because there's no like great end result, but it's heavy stuff. Heavy stuff. Joe can't buy a firearm anymore, or work as a janitor that he used to, because now they're employing people with mental illness that maybe Joe loses it and stuff, and they're not wrong in not doing that, but that heaviness of dictating somebody's life trajectory. When I say it's just a heavy feel that it takes a toll after time.
Yeah. Do you feel like it's mandatory to be a successful therapist to have those emotional connections that we were talking about, or is it just the most effective?
Uh, I have met a lot of therapists that are just very clinical. Well, here's your workbook. Work on these skills. Do your breathing exercises. Take your colored crayon, do your coloring or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
And they purposefully keep a distance from it. Um, it. I don't personally feel that that's very effective, but it has some utility for sure. Um, and the unfortunate thing too is there are a lot of people out there that are really heavy to share that space with. Their damage and their maladaptive behaviors and their reactivity and transference and all those elements. It's again another very heavy thing, and there's no perfect model. So how close, how far, and then you may have to change that from you're expected to flip on a switch. Oh, client walked out, client walked in. In the 2 minutes that it took for them to walk out and in, you have to change your entire persona and script because they have a whole new problem, a whole new personality. Some people have over the top attachment issues, and then you have to keep them more distant. And some people are very distant, and you have to try to get them to warm up, to open up. And it's mental gymnastics to try to keep that.
Yeah.
So,
Um,
so far as a good model, and I don't have any answers. Um, I just wish more people had access to a social support. I think it's part of our societal illness that we have, to where we don't have friends and family that can sit down and really be authentic.
hmm. Yeah, I think that would make a really, really big difference. If that became more socially normal, you know,
Yeah,
you wouldn't have to pay some random person to sit there and be emotionally attached to you.
essentially
And
paying them to give a shit.
right, you just would have somebody in your life that gave a shit.
Right.
Well, it's not like, to be fair, it is not just giving a shit
Right.
that it can make a difference in these people's lives. I mean, you're an expert in your field, and
Yes.
you've studied, and you have tools, and you have understanding that you
Yes.
can really help these people with. But um, not everybody needs all of those things all the time.
No.
It seems like a lot of people could find a lot of benefit just from having somebody give a fuck.
Weird.
And
And one of the things with the social media is, the instant gratification. How many hours we spend just zoned out, just checked out of connecting. And yet
mm,
everyone's looking, oh, well, social media, I'm connecting to people. That's not connecting. That's not a human connective experience, but it
it's,
might
it's something
appear to be
else.
that way.
Yeah.
um, yeah, I wish I had a better model, but I can say the one that's in place though is it's a tough one to work in.
Interesting. Yeah. One of the other things I wanted to get into that I think a lot of people could really benefit from some of your perspective on, um, outside little bit outside of the realm of therapy, a little bit outside of the realm of trauma, things we've already been talking about, is there's a couple different ways to say it. But one of the ways I was thinking is, does religion have a monopoly on spirituality? Why or why not?
Mm, there, again, religion, whether whatever religion you want to address, or spirituality, if it's according to that term, can be used powerfully for good and powerfully for not so good things.
Mm.
Um, religion as a term, there's all kinds of religion. It's a construct, and often it's mainstreamed in the main religions of Christianity and other things, and they have a religion. What is it? The something of the spaghetti monster as a religion. The
Oh, yeah. The flying spaghetti monster. Yep.
flying spaghetti monster religion, right?
Yeah.
To,
Yeah.
poke fun in contrast to that. And it has a it depends on what it's used for. The religion, spirituality can be used for good, can be used in maleficence. But again, it goes back to social constructs. Who's buying in, what they're buying into, and um, there's certainly not so great things. I mean, there's a lot of people that have died in the name of religion that was pretty much the opposite of what religion was set up to do, of being accepting, non-judging. And they had crusades, and it was an excuse to motivate the minds of people. Um, I like this the Stoics, where they say, or the Gnostics, that are knowledge above all else. If you have somebody telling you, well, that if you're not thinking, if you just blindly accept, and a lot of different facets, they'll just want you to blindly accept what they're telling you. But I definitely like the thought of thinking for yourself. That may be true for them and their perspective, but is it true for me, and is it right for me?
Hmm. Well, I think a lot of the my small audience that I do have um, is post-religious, or I mean, a host of other things, but that's kind of one of the main topics of what I like to talk about here.
Mm-hmm.
And I think oftentimes when people leave their whatever religion they were born into, most of the time, which they didn't really get to choose, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then they get a bunch of knowledge, like you were saying, and then they decide that that's not what they want to do with their life anymore. The only version of spirituality that they ever knew was what was taught to them in this religion as kids, as teenagers, whatever it might be. Um, and then they throw all of it out. Um, and then I think a lot of people, and this I'm currently in the process of understanding and learning and trying to find what spirituality can look like without being attached to any specific religion or ideologies that require. My big thing is belief on bad evidence. It just doesn't sit right with me. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't do belief on bad evidence very well, or at all. I try not to.
Right.
And realizing that there is still spirituality to be had. There's still a relationship with the spiritual self, with the spiritual world that you live in, with the spirituality in other people, in other beings, in animals, nature, like all these things. There's spirituality to be had, but it all gets thrown out Thanks for listening to part 1 of my episode with Travis Stevens. Be on the lookout for part 2. We're going to get into religion, spirituality, some of Travis's background. And if you submitted an audience question and I didn't get to it in this episode, also be on the lookout for that in the next episodes. Thanks, y'all.